Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. Welcome everyone to ACCP's CSR Marketplace virtual program, and specifically for today's session, Navigating Shifting Expectations Around Corporate Responsibility, hosted by Changing Our World. My name is Jean Metzger, ACCP's Vice President of Membership, Marketing, and Communications, and I'm so glad you were able to join us today. For those of you who may be new to ACCP, the Association of Corporate Citizenship Professionals is the premier membership association working to improve the effectiveness of corporate social impact professionals. We connect our members to the people, knowledge, and resources they need to enhance the impact they are having in their companies and in their communities. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that this is just one session of several that is being hosted this week. On the slide, you'll see our CSR Marketplace virtual schedule for the week, and you can still register for the remaining programs. They are all being recorded, and we will be making the recordings available to everyone who registers. In terms of upcoming ACCP events, ACCP is committed to providing high-quality programming that shares practical and actionable insights. In addition to this week's CSR Marketplace, we have several programs coming up, including our monthly webinars and our Impact Measurement Summit in early December. Registration is open for all of these programs on our website. We also have confirmed dates for our 2025 Forum CSR Intensive, which will be held in April and in Chicago next year, and our 2025 Annual Conference, which will be held in Atlanta next September. For those of you who may be interested in learning more about ACCP membership, you can visit our membership page for details on benefits and pricing. You'll see a QR code and the web address on the screen. And for those of you who are already members, we do encourage you to share information about ACCP to your network, as member referrals are our #1 source of new members. You'll find sample language and tools on our Member Get a Member webpage. Now for some webcast housekeeping. We have enabled transcripts and closed captioning for this webcast. Click Live Transcript to view subtitles. If you click the caret on Live Transcript and select View Full Transcript, you'll see the full transcript of the webcast. Chat is also enabled for you to engage with one another and with our panelists, and we encourage you to do so throughout the webcast. You can use the Q&A feature to ask panelists questions. And if you see a question that resonates with you, please click the thumbs up button by the question to upvote it. We will have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the webcast, but feel free to put in your questions throughout the program. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters today, Leah Brody and Maureen Flynn from Changing Our World.
Hello, thank you so much, Jean. We are so excited to be here today, and thank you everyone for joining us for our session focused on navigating shifting expectations around corporate responsibility. As Jean mentioned, my name is Maureen Flynn, and I'm joined by my colleague, Leah Brody. And together we will be diving into some of the key insights from our latest research report, the Authenticity Imperative, which we're actually launching this week, today. So for those of you who are joining us today, you're getting the very first sneak peek at our findings, and we will be officially launching it throughout the week. So we want to spend some time today with you all exploring some of the trends that are driving the shifts that we're certainly seeing in our day-to-day work, walk you through our high-level findings, and talk through what we think are some of the real actionable takeaways of the research, and some of the things that can help companies effectively navigate through this evolving landscape. So on the next slide, before we kind of dive into the research, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce Changing Our World for those of you who may not be familiar with us or who we are, what we do. But Changing Our World is a social impact consulting firm And we are part of the Omnicom network, which is a major communications holding company. You may be familiar with some of our sister agencies. We get to frequently partner with a lot of great sister agencies of ours that work in PR and branding and advertising and other aspects of communication. But we are the only agency that's dedicated specifically to social impact. Our firm has two practice areas. We have a nonprofit practice, and our colleagues over there work with organizations around strategic planning and nonprofit fundraising. And then Leah and I lead our corporate practice, and we work with companies across all industries to help design and implement social impact programs and strategies. We also have been very lucky to have a lot of ACCP members as our clients over the years. And occasionally we get to take a quick break from our day-to-day work and focus on some fun special projects like this survey and the research that we're going to walk you through today. So back in 2018, some of you who may be familiar with us may be aware that we did conduct a study focused on Americans 18 to 65, really to get a sense of how they viewed authenticity when it comes to corporate citizenship. Authenticity is a word we hear a lot. It gets thrown around a lot. And what we found back then was that there was really clear expectation from both consumers and employees for companies to act responsibly. Not surprising, but that consumers and employees both really wanted companies to focus not just on profits, but also on investing in building a better world. And when we looked at the findings back then, along with those expectations, there also came a lot of skepticism. Many people felt that while companies made big promises and were talking about doing the right thing, that often they didn't deliver. So this really sort of led to the sense that for a lot of companies, it was more talk than action. It became clear back then, as we were kind of digging through the findings, that there was a real gap between bridging what companies were saying and what they were actually doing. And since authenticity can really be one of those vague concepts and it's hard to kind of define, we really wanted to kind of dig in to better understand what it really meant when it came to corporate responsibility. So we looked at what some of our sister agencies focus on when it comes to kind of branding and talking about authentic brands. And really what we uncovered is that it's often, those brands that are perceived as genuine and transparent and stay true to their identity. But in our space and kind of the corporate responsibility world, it wasn't just enough to kind of throw out the term. We really wanted to dig deeper and understand, what does authenticity really mean in the context of CSR? So the bigger question that came up was really, can a company actually control how authentic they are perceived? And we believed back then, and we still believe now, that yes, companies can influence how authentic they're viewed. And in our early study, we found that there was a surprising amount of consistency around what people viewed as authentic and alternatively inauthentic. So now, as we look at our latest findings from 2024, the big question is, do the results from 2018 still hold true? So just some initial insights, and we'll be diving in a bit. As we look at the data from 2024, we've noticed a big shift in how people view corporate responsibility. Unfortunately, folks are definitely a little bit more jaded than they were in 2018. There's certainly growing skepticism, and it's getting harder for companies to build trust and convince people that they're genuinely committed to making a difference. But with, I think, the increased focus on transparency and definitely the rise of stakeholder activism, which we've been talking about for a lot in the last few years, I think companies really can't afford to back away from this work. We know that those that are still reaping rewards, things like trust and loyalty, consumer support, and even better employee engagement and recruitment, we believe are the ones that are taking a thoughtful and strategic approach to their social impact strategies. So while the expectations for companies to act more responsible hasn't gone away, it's actually more important than ever to be super intentional and proactive about how these actions are perceived. So one of the key shifts we've observed is that authenticity has moved from being an opportunity to really being an imperative. In 2018, it was something companies could leverage for competitive advantage, but today it's baseline expectation. There's no room for inauthenticity if you want to survive and thrive in this space. But that said, it's not just about sticking to the same formula. We've definitely taken a look at the data and identified a few important tweaks that companies are making to kind of meet these evolving expectations. So Leah and I will dive into some of these specific strategies a little later in the session. But the takeaway here is really that the demand for authenticity has grown and companies need to adapt. So I will pass it over to Leah to start diving in.
Thanks, Maureen. So today we're going to walk through some of the high-level findings from each section of our report. So we've divided it into 5 sections based on the themes that really emerged from the data. So our first chapter, Come Hell or High Water, also you'll notice a theme throughout this session and the report itself, ocean theme. But our first chapter, Come Hell or High Water, centers on the staying power of corporate responsibility. So despite how the world has changed over the past 6 years, corporate responsibility continues to be a non-negotiable, with over 2/3 of respondents believing companies should support social causes and issues. But we can also see that the tides are turning a bit and the generational gap is real. We'll discuss the growing skepticism that we're seeing, especially in a segment of the younger population. And with Gen Z poised to outnumber boomers in the workforce this year, it's really important that we pay special attention to this demographic. But despite these changes, we really believe that companies can be a force for good through authenticity. In our All Hands on Deck section, we discussed the 4 key characteristics of authenticity that emerged from our 2018 study and see how they still hold true today. And we'll end with smooth sailing ahead. So this is our recommendation section designed to help us navigate some of the choppy waters that we often find ourselves in as corporate responsibility practitioners. And so while we won't be discussing our full findings today, we hope our session gives you some good insight into what we're seeing, and we'll be sharing a report out after so you can really dig in on your own time. Before we really get into the data, we do want to start with a quick poll. So we're going to be talking a lot today about generational expectations when it comes to corporate responsibility, and specifically the changing expectations we're seeing with Gen Z. So we'd love to hear from you. How prepared is your organization to adapt its CR strategy to meet shifting expectations across generations? We'll give you a couple seconds to respond. Okay, great. So we're seeing a mix. We're seeing over a quarter are actively adapting to meet these shifts, and almost half are starting to think about these shifts. For those who are actively adapting to meet these shifts, we'd love to hear from you in the chat about what you're doing and any, great takeaways or tips that you have to share with others in this session. And for those folks that, are in the early stages or haven't started thinking quite yet, we hope this session will offer some helpful insights into how to get started. So as we all know, the world has changed significantly since our last report came out in 2018. With the pandemic, increased political unrest, an amplified focus on racial justice and climate change, this has all shaped public discourse and more generally just how we all live and exist in society. But despite what has been 6 years of pretty unbelievable change, people the majority of people continue to believe that companies should act in the best interests of the people, planet, and society. So in both 2018 and 2024, nearly 70% of all respondents agreed that companies should support social issues and causes, and that they trust socially responsible companies more. On this side here, we're really looking at the middle generations, millennials and Gen X, and you can see that they're especially likely to feel that companies have a responsibility to give back to society. And when we start to look at the other age groups, we can see significantly less agreement when it comes to Gen Z, with only 59% agreeing on both fronts. This is a major drop from 2018, where 77% of under 25-year-olds agreed that companies should support social issues and causes, and that they trust socially responsible companies more. So as you all know, we're at a really unique time in our workplace. There are more generations in the workplace than ever before, and they're all bringing unprecedented perspectives on work in general, but also on corporate responsibility. And as I mentioned before, there's a major generational shift happening now as well. A recent Glassdoor report framed it as more Zoomers, fewer boomers. And I think just as it was when millennials were really entering the workforce, there's a lot of discourse out there on Gen Z and the new and differing ways they're approaching basically everything from content consumption to how they talk with their bosses. But they're making up a really large and important share of the American workforce. And as corporate responsibility professionals, we need to be aware of their perspectives on our work. When we look at the data, it's clear that Gen Z thinks about corporate responsibility differently than other generations. What we're seeing is that segments of young Americans are showing much more skepticism when it comes to altruistic activities than other generations are. And these are differences that we didn't see with this same age group in 2018. So in our report, we look at this from a few different lenses, including both workplace and brand loyalty, brand favorability and forgiveness, perspective towards those traditional tenets of authenticity that Maureen had mentioned earlier, and attitude towards company responses to hot button issues. On this slide, we're looking specifically at workplace loyalty. We asked respondents, if you're working for a company where you feel that their corporate responsibility work is authentic, what would make you want to work there longer? Put in extra effort, feel proud to work at that company, recommend the company as a good place to work. And you'll see a really big difference here on how the two age groups answered. We found that compared to 78% of millennials, 50% of Gen Zers would work at that company longer. Compared to 80% of millennials, 58% of Gen Zers would feel proud to work at that company. Compared to 58% of millennials, 45% of Gen Zers would put in extra effort at work. And compared to 74% of millennials, 55% of Gen Zers would recommend that company as a good place to work. This was really surprising for us because I think so often statements around workplace loyalty and pride are kind of the rallying cry for our profession. One of the reasons that we do this is because of that positive impact that we know it has on employee pride and morale. And I think it's particularly interesting because we know that the world of work has really changed over the past couple of years. And this age group has not had the traditional workplace experience in the same way that other generations had. And also, we asked these same questions in our 2018 survey, and the responses from this same age group were much more closely aligned with the responses from other age groups. So it's not just a case of younger people generally having lower workplace loyalty scores, or they've just had less time in the workforce. We do see a difference with this age group at this point in time. Here we're looking at brand loyalty, and you can see that the findings are pretty similar. 56% of Gen Z respondents say they would recommend a product to family or friends because they deem the company providing them to be responsible, compared to the average response rate of 64% for all respondents. And Again, only 49% of Gen Zers say that they would choose a company's product over another because they deem that company responsible, compared to the average response of 60%. And you can also see, a decrease from our 2018 study overall, and that the general population is slightly less likely to show loyalty based on a company's commitment to social responsibility than they were in 2018. And we're not going to go through all the findings of our report here. We want to leave a bunch for you to look through on your own. But in our report, we do also touch a bit on the halo effect and looking at how likely different generations are to forgive a company for an occasional issue or problem when they feel the company is genuinely committed to social issues. And while Gen Z might be less likely than other generations to favor companies based on their corporate responsibility efforts, they really fall right in the middle of the pack when it comes to forgiveness, which is just kind of interesting to see. So as Maureen mentioned earlier, our 2018 survey underlined several characteristics of authenticity. And all of these our 2024 respondents still agree with. This includes factors like, corporate responsibility being more genuine when it's aligned to a company's business strategy, or it being more authentic when focused on long-term goals. So overall, we're still seeing respondents today agree with this. But we're also seeing a larger segment of Gen Z respondents questioning these tenets more so than any other generation. So here we're looking at leveraging core assets. Maureen will speak to this in more detail in the coming slides, but we know that leveraging core assets is a key way for a company to demonstrate authenticity in their corporate responsibility. And you'll see here, while the majority of Gen Z respondents agree with this, you can also see that they're in significantly less agreement than other generations, and that they're more than twice as likely to perceive this approach as less authentic than other age groups. In this report, we do the same when we examine other indicators of authenticity, including leveraging skills and expertise and having a long-term plan for your corporate responsibility efforts. And again, while the majority of respondents still believe these are the leading factors of authenticity, you'll see similar trends in the report from the Gen Z responding group. The majority of them are still in agreement with these tenets, but a growing segment of them are questioning these indicators more than we're seeing in other age groups. And while we don't think that these responses mean that Gen Z is uninterested in corporate responsibility or that they view it negatively, it does show that growing skepticism, and that simply applying a company's capabilities or aligning efforts with a company's core business strategies isn't necessarily enough to be seen as authentic. To strengthen that perception, we believe that companies need to continue to focus on approaches grounded in transparency, adaptability, and trust. And we'll get into that and what that looks like when we get to our recommendations section. Oh, Maureen, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. So as Leah mentioned, despite the shifts in how people are viewing corporate responsibility, we really believe that companies can still be a force for good, especially when they prioritize authenticity. And so as we talked about earlier, many of the characteristics that we saw bubble up in 2018 definitely still hold true now. Back in 2018, these were sort of the 4 key characteristics that were recognized as indicators of authenticity. So having a long-term strategy and really sharing that strategy so that it was clear kind of what and why you were focusing in particular social issues and causes. And then certainly how that kind of aligned to a company's ability to leverage their core assets, which Leah just touched upon. Certainly your people, your products, your technology, but really articulating that alignment so that it made sense for folks. Then putting real skin in the game. This is really, when we talk about putting real skin in the game, really about companies leveraging their own resources, not just relying on things like employee fundraisers or consumer campaigns to kind of show commitment to a cause. Those are certainly fine, but definitely when done in conjunction with kind of a real corporate commitment. And then lastly, third-party endorsements. So really recognition from other organizations and entities that can kind of speak to the credibility of an organization, talk about their commitments, and showcase it on their behalf. These were definitely agreed across all ages and genders pretty consistently. So while these characteristics definitely still resonate, we've definitely seen a shift in how strongly people feel about them now in 2024. And as Leah mentioned earlier, it's not just driven by younger audiences, across all age groups. There's definitely a more cautious and critical lens when evaluating corporate responsibility efforts. So we'd love to just hear in the chat from anyone else if there's other kind of core characteristics that come to mind for you when you're thinking about this work or when you're focusing on your own programs and strategies. So feel free to drop them in the chat. On the next slide, okay, so we wanted to dive into 2 of these areas, but definitely we encourage you to download the full report because we're not kind of covering all 4 here today. But starting with leveraging core assets, this is really one of the most powerful ways that companies can demonstrate authenticity, definitely taking advantage of the unique strengths and resources that they have to make a real difference. And this is not a new trend. It's certainly something that we've seen companies do for a long time now, but I think really taking a step back to evaluate how this could be done better is even more critically important, kind of taking an authentic approach. Our findings show that this is still largely seen as authentic, but it's slightly decreased since 2018. You can see it in the chart there, 66% of folks compared to 73% in 2018. What's especially interesting is the change in sentiment from 18 to 25-year-olds. Again, as Leah talked about earlier, Gen Z is becoming more skeptical about whether this is sort of a core component of, doing well and if it's considered authentic. But, to stay authentic in the eyes of this younger, more skeptical audience, we do encourage companies to be super transparent about how they're leveraging their core assets. Make it part of your story. Don't bury how you're doing this. But we do think that awareness and visibility around the why can be definitely helpful. So for some, this might mean going beyond traditional efforts and finding innovative ways to kind of embed social impact into your business model. We definitely see that companies, are demonstrating more integration of social responsibility into their day-to-day operations. And this might be a way to kind of gain trust and credibility, especially with Gen Z. And then moving over to third-party advocates, people still view a company's efforts as more authentic when they hear it from other folks, like their nonprofit partners, from employees of the company, or even in news stories, rather than directly from the company themselves. Advertising and their own social media kind of seen as less credible. But definitely when it comes to nonprofit partners, this is a huge one. This was seen as 50% more credible than hearing about it from a company's own advertising. So take advantage of those relationships with the partners you have. What's interesting when you dive into kind of the broader findings in our report is that while this is what's deemed most credible, it's not necessarily where people go to get their information. Our research actually shows that when people are actively seeking out information, they primarily turn to company-led sources. So things like the company's website or their own advertising or their social media channels. So this feels like a great opportunity for companies to kind of better amplify the voices of their nonprofit partners, be thoughtful about how they're showcasing their efforts in their own channels, and really think about how they can fully reach broader audiences. Not surprisingly, older generations, when we kind of looked at that segment of the population, are tending to still get information from traditional news media and advertising, while younger generations are leveraging social media and the websites. So this really supports the case for tailoring your communications and segmenting your strategy to reach different audiences and even sub-audiences across your employee base.
All right, so I see we have some really good questions coming up in the Q&A. Thanks, everyone. So we're just going to finish up here with our key takeaway section, and then we'll dive into those questions. So despite all of the changes that we're seeing, we really find that in the end, the promise at the heart of corporate responsibility, doing well by doing good, still stands today. But it's an uphill battle to constantly fight for our work, and it's only made harder when we're up against this growing skepticism, both externally and within our own office walls. But there are a few things that we can do that we believe can really help us navigate these rough waters. So as Maureen was just alluding to, number one, really creating that tailored communications approach. We know that we cannot rely on a one-size-fits-all strategy for engaging and communicating with different generations. So it's really all about segmenting our communications so we can create content that resonates with different audiences. The data that we have in this report is really so valuable, and you'll see more when you read it because we get into communications channels, and as Maureen was saying, how different generations access information. So, if we know that older folks are more bought into corporate responsibility generally, and we know that they tend to get their information from news media and advertising, it probably makes more sense to focus those comms on storytelling and impact. Whereas if we're learning that younger generations are a little bit more unsure of corporate responsibility, but they access most of their information through social media, then maybe it makes more sense to focus those comms on education. So it's really about working with your team and your communications team and leveraging stakeholder engagement to make sure that you're reaching the right audience with the right messaging. For number two, it's really about striking a balance. There is value between having long-term commitments and addressing issues as they arise. So of course, we're not saying to abandon your long-term corporate responsibility strategy. It is still a key indicator of authenticity, but there is so much value in remaining flexible and responding to immediate needs. Through the creation of something like a rubric or a decision-making guide, you can establish criteria to help you decide when and how to address issues while considering factors like relevance to your customers, employees, and other stakeholders, as well as alignment with your overall company mission, values, and priorities. And this will help you set parameters for when to say yes, while still being strategic about your decision-making. Number three, going back to education, it's really all about educating others. As corporate citizenship professionals, it's our responsibility to educate others on the purpose of our work. Gen Z especially, as our report shows, that they are more unsure about the goals and impact of our initiatives than other generations are. So here's another example from the report. In our survey, we asked respondents their feelings about the role and purpose of senior leaders in this field, like chief sustainability officers. Gen Z were more likely to be unsure about the purpose of these roles than other age groups. So part of it might just be like, they're not really sure what this work is, and they're not totally understanding the purpose of some of these roles. So there's a really big opportunity to teach them about the function of this work and these positions. We also saw in the data that Maureen shared that respondents deemed employees the second most credible source for helping others learn about a company's good deeds. So your employees are your best advocates. They are your real human advertisements that people have a lot of faith in. So it's really important to educate them on the purpose and impact of your programs. And finally, working to build that trust with your stakeholders. I think if we had to sum up this report in one sentence, it would be that corporate responsibility builds trust when perceived as genuine. Participants in both our 2018 and 2024 studies showed a greater willingness to forgive an occasional mishap by a company they believe is authentically committed to addressing community needs. But we know that building this trust takes time and effort. So there are a few different things you can do. You can start by being proactive with your social impact efforts, and not just leaning on them as a crutch or a Band-Aid when something goes wrong. If mistakes are made, be transparent and outline what you're doing to address it. And also make sure to engage your stakeholders regularly and the progress and results of your programs. And then finally, make sure that the work you're doing aligns with the values and mission of your company. I think otherwise it is going to feel very insincere and kind of like an afterthought or an add-on and not an inherent part of your business. So we're thrilled to have been able to share some excerpts from our report with you today. While we talked through some of the data, we certainly didn't touch on it all, and we'd love for you to download the report. It's on our website under our Thought Leadership page, but you'll also receive a link to download it when ACCP shares follow-up materials from the session. So now we can get into some Q&A.
It's awesome, guys. Thank you so much for this insightful new data. So we do have several questions in the Q&A section, and I encourage our participants to add more. But the first one is, how much do you factor in life stages among these two groups? Millennials are likely to have families and are maybe less likely to take risks.
So I think for this question, and Maureen, please chime in if you have anything to add. The really interesting thing is that because we had the 2018 data, we saw what the 18 to 25, 26-year-old group said in 2018, and it was much more aligned across many of the questions with other age groups. So in looking at the data now and seeing how different it is with those other generations, it really stands out as maybe not having so much to do with the life stage factor and more to do about what's happening in society.
Interesting.
100%
okay,
agree.
second question. Oh, Maureen, do you have anything to add? Sorry.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's very interesting to see the data that we had, because it is a drastic difference that indicates it's something else going on.
So our second question, is Generation Z seeking for civic engagement activities outside their company? And if so, do you have any of that data?
We didn't ask that in the survey, so we don't have data on that. I think anecdotally, we see from our clients that they are looking for a lot more ideas around how to engage employees overall in civic engagement. I think part of that is probably led by younger folks in the workforce. So unfortunately, we didn't address that in our report. I will say, though, that when it comes to kind of civic engagement, and you'll see this in the report, Gen Z is, I believe it's 4 times more likely than other generations to believe that their company should take political stances and be more involved in politics than other generations are.
I also make a plug for a resource that ACCP has free on our website called Making the Case. And so anyone can download that from our research and data page, which is under resources at accp.org. Okay, third question. Do you see a direct relationship between this lower/decrease in Gen Z corporate loyalty and trust compared with other generations, with the skepticism and erosion in overall institutional and political trust?
I think definitely. I think that there's a clear relationship with Gen Z's lower corporate loyalty and skepticism towards institutions and politics. And I think that there's been a lot of shifts that we've seen in trust and expectations on both sides. I mean, I think this is a generation that's grown up much more aware, and also access to more information. There's been economic instability and political polarization. So I think they're just more exposed, and that also leads to deeper skepticism towards things like companies and political institutions than I think we've previously seen.
Leah, do you have anything to add to
I think
that? Great. So I actually have a question, which is not in the Q&A, but understanding who the audience is, a lot of folks are responsible for employee engagement. How should we be thinking about employee expectation across generations as our members are implementing their programs?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to recognize that different generations have different priorities and values and experiences. So like Leah mentioned, you know, it can't be a one size fits all approach. I think that if one of the things we often recommend is getting that feedback from employees directly. So if you were at ACCP and you joined Leah's session, you know that we really enjoy stakeholder engagement, and we find it really valuable when it comes to getting feedback and perspectives. But certainly, I think surveys, focus groups, other sort of mechanisms for really understanding your employee perceptions and expectations when it comes to a range of corporate initiatives, whether it's ways that they can be involved, the commitments that you're making, understanding what they think is more authentic. So I think we've definitely seen that when, you know, companies take the time to gather feedback from their employees and engage them in the process, it definitely can lead to a more inclusive culture, and then certainly, you know, strengthen things like satisfaction, loyalty, overall pride in working for your company.
Great, thank you. Leah, anything to add there? Okay, next question in the Q&A. Is there an example, maybe from one of your clients, of how a company has partnered with nonprofits to build reputation and trust?
Oh gosh, I know that there is. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Maureen, does anything?
And I think not necessarily where the intention is to build reputation and trust, right? So many of the partnerships that we help facilitate for our clients are really around making sure they're win-win, mutually beneficial, all of those things. And so when you're co-creating goals and you're setting out on a multi-year relationship, you know, you get to know each other, and you want it to be where your partners are going to talk about the investments that you're making in their organization. You want them to talk about how they're going to, you know, further advance your mission. You want that partnership to be part of like their case for support in helping them attract other donors or investors. And so I think that it all stems from how you approach these partnerships. And so I don't think the majority of our clients go in with like reputation and trust as the number one driver, but long-term know that when you do this well and do it right and find that, you know, really great long-term partnership, that it can organically happen. And I think, you know, arming nonprofits with some of those stories or boilerplates or templates, communication resources, so that it's not a heavy lift for them, is also, I think, something that we've seen just be really useful for some organizations that may be under-resourced when it comes to things like communications and PR.
Yeah, that's great.
Totally agree. And I'd add that I think, you know, we really see this when companies work with the nonprofit to plug in to their needs and help wanting to achieve their mission, instead of coming in with an agenda saying we want to accomplish X, Y, and Z. How can you help us do this? But again, creating that partnership where you know, you're helping to achieve the goals that the nonprofit has already set out to want to achieve.
Yeah, that's great. What do you feel is the most relevant takeaway from the study, and what were you surprised at?
For me, the piece that really stuck out to me is all the information we got around workplace loyalty. I think that was a little shocking for me to see because, as I said, we have this rallying cry, I think, in our industry where we're like, our employees want this, especially the younger generations. They are asking for this. They are demanding it. And now we're seeing like, well, maybe that was true for millennials, but maybe it's not so true for Gen Z. And I think it just highlights how much the world of work has changed over the past couple of years. And really that, this younger age group has not experienced the workplace in the same way that almost all other generations have. And we need to really take a look at our programs, how we're talking about them. If people are hybrid now, like how are they receiving the information? What does it feel like in the office around these programs? And just really starting to tweak and assess them and make necessary changes to reach this new group.
I was really interested in the communications data. I think that generally, like social impact communications is something that we've been spending a lot of time on. So I think seeing what vehicles folks deem as credible versus where they go to find information was really interesting and something we should be aware of when we're thinking about communication strategies and tactics. So it'd be really interesting to find ways to kind of flip that so that where people go to get information is also what they deem to be credible.
Oh.
So there's work to be done there.
So I have another question. When you do, I guess you're gonna probably do another version of this at some point. But if you could do a follow-up study, what question would you want to ask to sort of dig in and better understand the data?
I'd want to dig because of how we did the survey, we weren't really able to ask follow-up questions. So I'd love to be able to go back to some of the Gen Zers who found those traditional tenets of authenticity to be less authentic than other generations and ask them why. What approaches would they find authentic? It would be wonderful if in a future study, we had the option to do a follow-up focus group or something like that. So I'd want to dig into that piece definitely.
That's great. Well, with that, we are just about at time. So I want to thank you both for this insightful data and bringing it to our community, for your support of ACCP. I want to thank all the participants for tuning in today. Very much appreciate it. Reminder that we are going to be, we have recorded this session and we'll make the recording available if you want to share it with others. Your feedback is very important to us. So before you sign off, we would appreciate if you would take a very, very short feedback survey. There's a QR code on the screen and there is a link to the survey in the chat. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone. And I hope you all have a great week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
It's been stalled on this.